wait till I log in, and then we'll introduce our speaker. So hold tight. Hello, everybody that's tuning in tonight. Good evening. Just give us a minute. We're going to wait for everybody to log into the program, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody out there. Good evening. I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Hudson Library. I have a couple little quick announcements tonight, some history programs you may be interested in. So this is a big one, so mark your calendars. This is in person. Tuesday, May 7th at 6:30, we have the one and only Eric Larson. That's May 7th at 6:30, and he's going to be talking about his newest book, The Demon of Unrest, which is about the Civil War and Fort Sumter and the beginning of the Civil War. Also in person, May 21st at 6:30, we have The Loves of TR. That's Theodore Roosevelt, in case you're wondering. That's by the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, Edward O'Keefe. And we have a virtual program that you may be interested in if you love ship and naval history. So virtual, May 23rd at 7 p.m., we have Eric J. Dolan, and he's going to be talking about a little known engagement, shall we say, in the War of 1812. His newest book is called Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, Survival at the Edge of the World. So if you're interested about any of these programs, go to hudsonlibrary.org to sign up. And another thing, we'd like to thank the Learned Owl. The Learned Owl is our local bookseller, and tonight you're going to see a link at the bottom of the page there, and it's going to tell you where to click and buy a book. So if you're interested in the book here tonight, keep looking for that link. And also, we have a Q&A section, which is at the very bottom of your screen there. So if you have any questions for our author, don't be shy. Go ahead and ask a question. So let's introduce our author. So tonight we have with us Dr. Rachel Lance, and she's going to be talking about her newest book, The Chamber Divers, the untold story of D-Day scientists who changed special operations forever. Previous book includes In the Waves, My Quest to Solve the Mystery of the Civil War Submarine. That's the CSS Huntley, in case you're wondering. So that's a fantastic book. So definitely check that one out. Dr. Lance has worked as a civil engineer for the U.S. Navy, designing underwater breathing systems and investigating patterns from trauma from explosions. She has an MA, and hopefully I can pronounce this correctly, Biomedical Engineering, there we go, at the University of Michigan, and also a PhD at Duke University in the same field. She is an assistant consulting professor at Duke University, where she conducts research out of their hyperbolic medicine facility. And she's actually coming to us not from Durham, North Carolina, where she is normally. She's at New York. So I'll turn it over to the doctor.
Hi, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, this is pretty exciting for me because this book is a World War II story. It's a true story. It's about a group of scientists who did some incredibly amazing and brave things, and they did it all using their own bodies. And what they achieved really contributed toward the success of the landings at D-Day. So as someone who kind of works in the same professional field, it's really exciting to me to be able to get to tell it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I like to do pictures only presentations. So you're not going to see a lot of words, but you're going to see a lot of imagery to kind of tie in with everything that I'm talking about here. So obviously just here's the title. Please feel free to call me Rachel. This book just came out last week, so it's only been out for a few days. So this is very early still in the release time. Okay, and just that background about me, which Derek already gave me a marvelous introduction. So I'm working out of the hyperbaric chamber facility at Duke University. There are 7 different chambers there, 3 of which we use for medical treatments and 4 of which super nerds like myself use for experimentation. So in this picture, I'm got my fanciest space alien scrubs on because that day we were going to high altitude, but they can be also pressurized and taken to low pressures, such as underneath the ocean as well. So the research group that we're going to be talking about today use tools like this, but on a smaller size scale than the one at Duke, in order to conduct a lot of the experiments. Okay. So in order to have this conversation about what they achieved, I want to first take us to a beach in France. This is a photograph from before the war of the casino and the beach in Dieppe, France, which is a vacation coastal town. It's beautiful, it's quaint, it's this place where people go to take a break and relax and play in the waves. In the distance on the far right-hand side of the photograph, you can see these gorgeous soaring white cliffs. This is what this town is sort of famous for. It's this nestled away little oasis in between these white cliffs that allows people to have a more peaceful and isolated vacation. It was thought of this way to the extent that even Claude Monet used it as his vacation destination. So this is one of Monet's several paintings. He did an entire series of the white cliffs at this beach. And you can see on the right-hand side, the start of that town during his time period and as it was just starting to grow. Okay, this picture is a little bit different. It looks similar. We still have people on vacation. We have people wearing fancy hats. People are lounging around. I can guarantee you pretty much that someone in this picture is eating ice cream somewhere. You can almost feel the vacation vibes. And you see the same cliffs in the background. The reason this picture is more important than the others is because this is one of only 3 images that were used by the Allied nations in order to plan their raid on this small French town in August of 1942. So the war is in full swing. Hitler is occupying a huge fraction of France. And in this beach town, there are now houses instead of vacationers filled with Nazi armed guards. And when the Allies decided that they needed to engage the war, they knew that at some point they would need to interact with Hitler on the European mainland. He was preparing at some point for an invasion of Great Britain, and in order to stop that gradual march across the world, they needed to take that fight to him there. The Russians were already struggling in the east. They had this huge and notoriously brutal battlefront open there, and they were pressuring the Allies. You guys need to really get into this war on the land with us. They wanted the Allies to open up a second front in the West. Opening that second front would divide the Nazis in 2, split their attention. But Winston Churchill, even though he's notoriously belligerent, he knew that this kind of beach landing was going to be incredibly difficult. He'd had that experience previously during Gallipoli in World War I, where he had been one of the officers in charge of sending troops in ashore in Gallipoli in the Middle East, and they ended up stranded on the beach for about a year. It was horrible. They never made it off the beach. The casualties were high. They dealt with insane temperatures, both high and low, as well as disease and starvation. And he knew from this experience that these beach landings were not as simple as simply driving your ship up the shore and unloading your stuff and then taking back out. The Allies decided to go anyway. Instead of listening to Churchill, they planned their beach landing for Dieppe, France on August 19th, 1942. What they didn't know at the time was that this town had been dramatically changed since the days of peaceful vacations. You can see on the right-hand side of the shore here, the same small peaceful town with its vacation homes, and on the left, the cliffs. But this photograph taken after the war also shows something far more deadly. Carved into the side of the cliff faces are now nests where the Germans had put not only heavy artillery, but machine guns and troops heavily equipped with lots and lots of grenades. So when the Allies landed, it was a nightmare. Unaware that these gun nests had been dug into the cliffs above their own heads, and unaware that the peaceful homes on shore were now actually heavily fortified and filled with machine guns as well, they did simply try to drive their ships up on shore, beach them, unload their tanks, and then take the town. What this meant was that at the mouth of every ship, you had a densely clustered group of troops just waiting to be picked off as a large group together. This is a painting from after the war. One of the things it omits is just the sheer number of bodies of the troops who had stormed this beach. This is considered one of the greatest disasters in Canadian military history because the majority of the troops for this particular invasion were Canadian. Beneath the worst of those machine gun nests was Blue Beach, beach codenamed Blue Beach. And that one was stormed by Canadians, and they had 97% casualties. Meanwhile, part of the reason for this raid, half-baked though it was because the war is not only raging on the European mainland, it's also really affecting the people of Great Britain. They've had food shortages and rationing since about 1939. And the Blitz, even though the heat of it has tapered off, is still very much ongoing in the sense of continued bombings of the major cities, especially down in the south. This is one image from London where Londoners were famously seeking shelter in the tube station because its depth underground gave them protection not only from the bombs, but from the noises of war. One of the things I thought was really interesting as I was researching this book is the number of people who talked not about the risk of dying, but about the fact that they couldn't really sleep and the sounds were giving them stress. So it was more about the sensory overload to them, like this constant presence of the war never gave them any peace. It's under this type of environment that DF has occurred. And with it comes this huge lesson. If you're going to storm a beach, you need advanced information. You can't just show up. You have to understand if there are machine guns. You have to understand if there have been nests and batteries dug into the cliffs. You have to understand what the terrain of the beach is like. When they got there, a lot of the tanks simply wouldn't work because the beach turned out to be made of rocks instead of sand. Many of them fully threw off their treads and just caught on fire, which is not how tanks should work. In order to do this, the Allies have decided to use a long-standing idea. So I've put here something, this is actually a sketch from Leonardo da Vinci's notebook and one of his many notebooks. And I picked this one because I thought it was kind of a beautiful example of just how long people have looked at this idea of underwater reading. One thing that's really important to me in this sketch is Da Vinci's designs would not have worked. This man, who's broadly now considered to be a genius, came up with a design for underwater breathing, underwater stealth, underwater scouting of beaches that was totally non-functional. Indeed, at the start of the war and by the early 1940s, this is what diving really looked like in practice. On the left, you have a picture from 1938. This is an American dive outfit. It still looks very much like Cuba Gooding Jr. and Men of Honor. That exact suit and some variations of that suit were used for decades because this was the best kind of idea we've really come up with. A person in an air-filled suit with a giant, heavy helmet so that they could sink down, and then air pumped to them by a surface ship. The right-hand version is the British version of the same. This is what they'd evolved to and used by 1950. This is important because the reason that people are using diving at this point in time is mostly for salvage. It's mostly for construction. If you're building a bridge, there's a lot less shooting than there is in war. So all of a sudden, instead of building bridges or instead of bringing up sunken ships, we now have this new application for divers that has incredible urgency because the Nazis are still murdering people on the mainland. The British citizen who stepped up is one of my favorite characters in history. This guy on the left, who's very lovable, there were oral histories recorded, literal people who served with him who talked about how bad the jacket he's wearing smelled. Because what's happening in this photograph is this is 1937, and he is demonstrating the use of a gas mask during the Spanish Civil War. His name is John Burden Sanderson Haldane. He went by JBS. A lot of people who liked him simply called him the prof because apparently he was always teaching. Even in the Spanish Civil War, which he volunteered in, he would give lectures about the spread of sexually transmitted disease and how genetics work. And when I preach to people about genetics, it seems to alienate them. But apparently the way JBS did it, they mostly found him charming. So he becomes either loved or hated because he's also known for having a temper. But what he inarguably possesses is incredible knowledge of underwater. physiology, and science. JBS Haldane grew up the son of the person who first figured out how decompression sickness works, which is known as the bends. It's caisson disease. It's very significant in American history because it went into the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And even at the age of 12, he became one of the first people in the world to safely dive to significant depths using these old-fashioned rigs. His dad let it because he knew that he had just proved how to do it safely. So JBS Haldane is in London at the beginning of the war when the bombings start. One of the first things that also happens is the summer of 1939, there are 3 submarines that go down in rapid succession. The USS Squalus sinks in a training accident. The HMS Thetis, a British sub, sinks in a training accident. And the French Finis, off the coast of Vietnam, sinks in a training accident, all within 3 weeks of each other. That's really never talked about because a lot of the Allies were, I think the correct reaction would be panic. The British definitely seem to have been panicking. And they were looking at, how did people die? Why didn't they get out of these submarines? We gave them essentially leather bags to escape and swim out. How come only 4 people from the Thetis made it out? Everybody else died inside. So JBS Haldane gathers some of his friends. This is him in the center. He's a big guy, which makes me like him a lot because I'm really tall myself. So we could have seen each other across the crowd. But he's got 4 of his friends here, and they start conducting tests on themselves. They climb inside a hyperbaric chamber. They say, hey, this we can seal shut. It's kind of like a sunken submarine. They start exposing themselves to the types of gases that would have happened for the submariners. And they demonstrate the first principles of underwater breathing. The Allies have built these submarines, but they really haven't built breathing systems in them. They've only built them, set them out to sea, and assumed everything would be fine. Haldane and his crew here showed that they really need more attention to the breathing, especially if they want anyone to survive in the event that a sub goes down. The government, in true kind of government fashion, and as a former government employee, I can say this, but they kind of see this guy and they're like, this guy knows his stuff. You start working on this. We're gonna go do the war part over here. You tell us all the science when you're ready. But we don't have any money to pay you, so just goodbye. Deal. It'll be fine. But Haldane, because he's been in 2 wars by this point by himself, World War I and the Spanish Civil War, thinks that war is just a horrific atrocity, is willing to participate, and is willing to contribute the science that he can in order to help bring it to a close more quickly. Okay, so one of the things they start doing, and Haldane has this lab of scientists too. So the scientists and the geneticists start to get in on it. They start taking these breathing systems that already exist for mine rescue. So this is an image of it. They're generally just a leather bag with a mouthpiece and some valves. And they have a little canister. You can see the little canister on the guy's right shoulder that scrubs out the carbon dioxide using a chemical reaction. Then they have a little bottle. You can see that bottle by his left elbow that adds in more oxygen. They take these, they start waterproofing them, and they say, hey, we're going to be the ones to figure out how to send these divers in underwater using these breathing apparatuses on purpose. I don't know about you. If someone handed me this and said, hey, escape from a submarine at 200 feet underwater, I would have feelings about that. The Americans are not quite doing the same. They eventually start copying the British, but they're at an equal place in the research. So this is a picture or 2 pictures of what was happening in America at this time. This is in Fort Pierce, Florida, which is where the first Navy SEALs start developing their training and their protocols during World War II. They were not named the SEALs at the time. That name didn't come out until about 20 years later. But the first ways that they were diving are the exact same ways the British were. You can see the gentleman on the left wearing it, and you can see the pieces on the right. This is actually a gas mask. So this is a mask designed for mine rescue. And the US Navy issued official guidance on how to modify this so that you can use it as diving equipment. This is before the invention of modern scuba. Jacques Cousteau is actually working on that at the same time in Nazi-occupied France. All right, so people start to use this. Submariners start to use this. They start to train escaping from submarine towers, like you can see in this picture. But really what's going on in terms of the breathing mechanics is still largely unknown. So this group with JBS Haldane at the helm and his lab geneticists start testing it on themselves. They figure, if we're going to give this to people and we're going to put them out in the line of fire, we need to go first and make sure that it's actually going to work the way that it's supposed to. This is extremely true even today when you're talking about breathing apparatuses. If I built a breathing apparatus and I just handed it off to people and I never tested it first, that would obviously be wildly irresponsible of me. So what they're doing is they're putting themselves on the line as the first testers of these modified breathing apparatuses to enable not only escape from any submarines that might sink during the war, but ultimately to enable the scouting of beaches before military operations, to try and minimize the body count. Now, hyperbaric chambers are kind of a unique environment. One of the things that I think is hilarious about this photograph is their clothing. One of the things that I really like to point out to kind of give people an idea is when you're inside this, you're essentially inside a compressor. The gas is being shoved in. It is loud. The noise is one of my biggest sensory inputs from working inside a hyperbaric chamber myself. We actually keep ear protection in ours in case people just get like overstimulated from it. But it's also hot. As you pack that gas and you're compressing it, it heats up, right? So these guys are in here in sweater vests and sweaters. And I was like, you set this up for the photographer. But I'm glad that they did, because now we have this beautiful image demonstrating what they're doing and how they're doing it. Give you this visual of what these experiments look like. Okay, so this group ended up conducting 611 experiments on themselves over a total of 248 separate days. In between those days, they had setup, they had breakdown, they had equipment maintenance. They also had their day jobs. This was something they were doing for free for the government in addition to their normal work. But more importantly, they had breaks because they were being bombed. So this lab with all of these chambers is subject to the constant rainfall of bombs that we know as the Blitz, and that keeps going on throughout the entire course of the war. One of the experiments that I want to talk about today is with this young lady who's pictured here. And I don't have time to go into all of the types of experiments that they did, but she deserves so much credit, in my opinion, because she was one of the first, or she was the first person to discover a principle that, had she not figured it out, could have killed all of their divers, or at least a substantial fraction. During one test day, Elizabeth German was using her breathing apparatus underwater. She decided it worked, it functioned properly, and so she got into another chamber. She had just been puttering around the water tank. She climbs out, she says, I'm good to go. She climbs down in the smaller chamber beside it. This one is not only a water tank, it has water at the bottom and it has the ability to pressurize. So Haldane climbs in after her. He's seated on a small wooden platform above her head. She's fully immersed in the water. It's cold water. It's 65 degrees. She's unprotected, but she knows this is what she signed up for. And he's got rubber fishing waders on, right? That's how he's dangling his feet in more comfortably. He closes the hatch behind him above his head. He passes her down a writing slate. He's got one for himself, and he gives the signal to the people on the outside to start pressurizing. He's in that air part. He's in that hot part. It heats up. It's loud. She pressurizes it up, and she starts breathing on her system underwater. It keeps working fine, at least for the first several minutes. And then almost out of nowhere, Haldane hears her make a squeak, and she starts to have a seizure. Elizabeth German was a fully qualified scientist. She had a degree in chemistry. She had remarkable grades. She spoke scientific German, which she actually learned for fun. So I both judge her and relate to her. But she was this incredibly brilliant mind who had decided to participate in these experiments And what she discovered that first time today is that oxygen gives you seizures underwater. So only a few months before, this exact same lab group had discovered that oxygen can give you seizures in the air. So they had found that out on their own bodies, but they had found that out while they were in the air. All of a sudden, now Elizabeth Sherman is in a water tank and she's seizing. She starts flailing. She starts clawing at her face. She's clawing at Haldane's legs. If they don't get her out before she knocks her mouthpiece out, she will inhale water and she will drown. If she had not figured this out in a lab first, the oxygen guidelines that the Allies were preparing to give to the divers were almost certainly fatal. She saved them from taking these out into the field. And because of her, they were able to not only use her data point, but to continue the test series and look at that and look at what was realistic. Elizabeth Sherman sees so hard that the muscles in her back crushed one of the vertebrae in her spine. She had debilitating back pain for the rest of her life, which she did not consider to be an issue. So she considered that she was fine after these experiments, even though they affected her and caused her pain for the rest of her life. But what they achieved was not only the ability to provide safe guidelines for the divers who are using these modified breathing apparatuses, but because they were also looking at carbon dioxide, they were able to help the Admiralty shrink down the breathing gas volume in submarines. So now instead of one big vessel that just survives and lets its people survive because it has a huge amount of gas in there and it takes a long time for things to go awry, they're able to build these really tiny versions. These are uncomfortable. They're 40 feet long and 10 foot tall, but this is what it looked like on the inside by the time you pack in not only the engine, but all the equipment, all of the gear that they need, as well as the hair dryer that they would use to dry off the electronics when the electronics would get too wet. And the reason they were sending these submarines is because they were sending in swimmers. So the submarines, equipped with the breathing supplies established by Haldane in the UCL lab, would go out in the months before D-Day, in the months before June of 1944, and they would rise to the surface at night, and they would deploy swimmers in specialized thermal diving equipment who would go ashore, who would measure the beach, who would take samples, make sure it was sand, not rocks like FTF, then come back to the submarine, which would sink underwater and stay submerged for 18 out of every 24 hours to avoid detection by the Nazis. The only reason they could do that was because of the breathing tests that had been done in advance. June 6, 1944 comes around, and not only are the British and Canadian beaches marked by these miniature submarines called X-craft, they bring in these channels for navigation. The submarines are waiting for the Brits and the Canadians on the edges of the beach to make sure that no one goes astray. And as a result, unlike at Omaha Beach, where a slight miscalculation landed so many troops directly in front of a gun battery, the British and the Canadians roll onto their beaches in the correct locations, the locations with fewer enemy guns, with relative success. Of course, nothing about D-Day can ever be considered to be easy, but the amount of lowered casualties in those beaches is, to me, a testament to how valuable this advanced preparation really was. On top of that, the Brits send in divers. They've got their divers with their breathing apparatuses, and they've got their divers with specialized gas mixtures that have increased level of oxygen that were custom tested for them by the UCL scientists on their own bodies before they sent them over to Normandy. The divers were in charge of clearing the beach obstacles. They were in charge of searching the underwater zones for ordnance. And as they made their careful sweeps, the landing area that was possible for all of the incoming ships and troops expanded outward and outward safely. As a result of this careful preparation, there was not one single casualty among the diving personnel. So this is just an image of those obstacles. These are some of the lesser known obstacles. I think from things like Saving Private Ryan, we're all familiar with the hedgehogs, which were those 6-pointed things, but the Nazis had riddled the beaches with them. And I think the picture on the right really demonstrates to what extent. And their goal was to stop this landing. So these divers were intensely operating. They were doing an incredible amount of work. And by the end of the first several days there, they reported that they got a little bit bored because they had used their breathing apparatuses and their skills to dismantle everything you see here. This is what divers have evolved to, at least in the UK by the end of the war. They've captured fins from the Italians. The Italians were the ones recorded as having the idea of fins on the feet. They've now got breathing apparatuses that are made specifically for them, that are modeled on the same ideas, the gas rebreathers, but that are made specifically for diving. So they're a little bit better and more waterproof. And they've worked them out including with the gas mixtures and the enriched oxygen mixtures with the science in order to use them safely. This is one particular diver that I'd like to talk about just a little bit because this is a group called the Pea Parties. And this was something that I had never really heard about. Because the British dive science had been so thoroughly advanced, they were able to send down divers into the harbors as they cleared them. So June 6th happens. The Allies take the beaches of Normandy, and then they began to expand along the French coastline, one harbor at a time. They begin to open France back up and chase the Nazis out away from these water ports, these water entry areas that are still incredibly key to shipping of food and supplies and even weaponry, because the war is still ongoing, in order to push that front of the war further into the European mainland. These teams, the Pea Parties, are kind of fascinating to me because they weren't created until toward the end of the war. They weren't created until it was clear that they were going to be able to send divers down safely. And so for these groups, they actually recruited young men and young people who were probably too young for combat. And the ones that were their attendants, the ones that were taking care of their gear and tending to them and monitoring them from the surface, were people that were too old for combat. So all of the reports describe this as kind of young boys being sent down to defuse bombs while they have these paternalistic watchers from on board above them. So one harbor at a time, these extremely young teenagers swam underwater, used their custom breathing apparatuses, and dismantled the bombs to ensure that there would be no blown up ships or disabled blocks to stop the Allied advances. And once again, these are incredibly key because there was not one single diving related casualty. I just love this picture because this is from the beaches of D-Day, and it's showing not only the number of explosive ordnance that these divers were digging up in the beach and the water regions. Obviously, they're pictured in the drive, but it shows kind of the variety. So these divers were sent down not only with improvised apparatuses, not only with gunfire happening above them and with ship propellers whirring above them, they had this huge variety of explosives as well. So they would go down there and not 100% know what they were about to encounter. All right, so that's actually the end of the presentation. I seem to have gone a little bit faster than I meant to, which is absolutely a thing that happens sometimes when I'm really excited about a topic. So if you'd like, I would be happy to start taking questions, or we could do a specific excerpt if someone wants to do that as well. But yeah.
Okay, sounds great. So yeah, don't forget, you can put some questions down there at the very bottom in the chat window. So somebody asked, and I did answer it. So Elizabeth, and I had to Google it. It's Jermyn. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that you mentioned in your book, and I thought it was interesting, and I have it circled here because I thought it was kind of interesting, is the martini effect that happened during some of the training. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Okay. This is one of the examples where science is not always terrible. I gave you one of the darker stories, like I gave you Elizabeth Jermyn having seizure because that was scientifically incredibly significant to the Allies. That was a huge discovery for them, because it meant they had to redo so many of their plans. But the Martini effect is the informal name for a lot more fun problem. So this is the problem that's more formally known as nitrogen narcosis. And that name is extremely literal. Nitrogen is actually a narcotic. There's some evidence that because the air we breathe every day is 78% nitrogen, we're all a little bit drunk all the time. So it's just a slight narcotic that we're used to functioning with. When you go to depth, when you go underwater, the gas you inhale has to be pressurized to the same level as the water. Our lungs are very weak. We cannot inhale. If the water pressure is outside us, we cannot inhale against that. So we breathe gas that's at the same pressure as the water. And what that means is you're now essentially getting more of those little nitrogen molecules in you. So now you're getting even more narcotic effect. The Martini's law is kind of the loose rule of thumb. Obviously, there's some variability based on people's individual alcohol tolerance, but the idea is that every 33 feet underwater is equal to about 1 drink. So if you really quickly, a drink taken quickly. So if you really quickly go down to 200 feet, 250 feet, you can imagine the effect. You're essentially slamming several glasses of hard alcohol in terms of the cognitive impact. And so these tests were really fun to talk about and they were so much fun to write because I had to go through the archival notes. So I went through this group's lab notebooks and they were gibberish. So they're trying to see if they can outrun it, essentially. They're trying to see if we pressurize really quickly, can we outrun this? Is this a dose response thing? Which is not a crazy question to ask, but it meant that they were basically starting out some of these tests by just getting really hammered at work. And so they were writing these notebooks that just were illegible, made zero sense. The numbers drifted all over the place. Like essentially what you would expect if you asked someone to do complex math after about 10 martinis.
I don't think I can do math under any other things, even alcohol. I'm terrible at math, but I could understand from your book. It was gibberish, and I can kind of understand that. But somebody asked the question that I was going to ask, so I'm glad. How did you get interested in this topic? It may have something to do with your previous book, but especially like Haldane and things like that. Like, how did you find out about this?
Yeah, it does have something to do with my previous book. So I really wanted to write a book about scientists who experimented on themselves because as a scientist, this is a lesser talked about thing about scientific culture. We've pretty much all done it at some point. And there are some reasonable exceptions, right? Like if someone makes new chemotherapy, they're not going to test it on themselves first. That's not reasonable. But people like me who work in a more physically practical environment, like of course I will try and see if the breathing system works before I put it on a test subject. Like to me, that's just responsibility. So I wanted to write a book about that and what that looks like and how it's an ingrained part of scientific culture. And one of the stories that I wanted to include was one that I talked about much more briefly in my first book, and that was Haldane and the Spanish war veterans who tested on themselves, looking at carbon dioxide. But the more I thought about that story, the more it really bothered me because that paper that they wrote, that very first paper from them, was written in 1941. And in academia, papers take a long time to come out. So that means they've done the research in either 1940 or 1939. And I was sitting there and I was like, why did they care about carbon dioxide when they're in London being bombed in their homes? So I knew that what they were working on had to be extremely important to them for some reason. So I just kept digging in the archives till I figured out the link and what they'd been asked to do by the Admiralty, which was first submariners, help the mini subs, and then eventually enable the beach landings of D-Day.
Wonderful. So this kind of dovetails into your question here. So your research, has this always been available to the public or has it been recently declassified or, what's the story behind that?
Um, a lot of it's been declassified over subsequent years. The first papers I think started being declassified in the 1970s. There was a huge batch of them that was declassified in 2001. So this hasn't always been available to the public. A lot of the people who were doing it actually passed away before it was declassified, and so they were never able to talk about it themselves. So that's why it's one of my big goals to like talk about it for them. I think what they did was very cool. They all got seriously injured, but they were trying to stop military personnel from getting injured in the water in a hostile held country, which I think is a noble goal. And then some of it was still under controlled access, and like I had to ask for it to be reviewed, so to be declassified.
One of the things I have to ask, and I had to look this up and I went to Wikipedia, but I'm hopefully you can understand it a little bit better than I can. So the bends, what are the bends? Why do they happen?
Okay, so the bends as a name actually started as a joke, and it's one of those jokes that went horribly awry. What happens is, and I'm going to use nitrogen because it's air, so it's the most common source of bends, but it can happen with any gas. When you're under pressure, like I talked about, we're breathing the gas at the same pressure level as around us. And so that gas starts to ooze into your body. And so when the nitrogen oozes into your body, what that means is that if you remove the pressure, the nitrogen is going to come back out. We now know that if you're scuba diving and you come up slowly, we have ways to do this safely. And so this has been a thing that's been known enough, long enough to do safely. JBS Haldane's father was actually the first one to figure out how to do it safely. But the bends is essentially all that nitrogen coming out of your tissues too fast in a way where it creates bubbles. Bubbles inside the body are bad. It's hard to get blood past the bubble. And so the bends is a reference to a posture of a way women would walk. So it accentuated their dresses. And people were doing it because they were having spinal pain. But yeah, the joke got less funny once people started dying and they realized it was fatal. It could be fatal.
So some of the experiments that were going on during World War II, we have a question somebody's asking, did that stop or did any of that have any impact to any things? You did mention Jacques Cousteau, but did any of this have any non-military impacts after the war?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yes. Let me clarify that. I love that question. So this is stuff that we actually all use today. Every recreational scuba diver has learned the safety guidelines that came out of this group, but nobody ever knew where they came from. Not even people in my field because it was classified. We just knew the safety guidelines. We knew you could do this far and do this long. And then there's never been any information about how that was determined in the first place. So everyone who's ever been scuba diving before has accidentally used this group's information.
Interesting. Wow, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. So we're talking about this a little bit before we went live here. We have a question. What are you researching now?
So I can't talk about it too much because I'm working on my third book. So I can't talk about it too much because the book deal is not finalized yet. But I'm pretty sure that I've found America's first female special agent, and she would have been active during World War I. And the reason I'm not sure, the reason I use some hesitation there is because I have circumstantial evidence that J. Edgar Hoover destroyed all of the records of all female agents prior to him working for the FBI. So I'm sure she was a special agent. I'm not sure she was first because if he burned all the records, then there might have been others.
No, that's my time period. So I'm very interested in that.
Oh, cool.
Um,
Yeah.
So I think you hit upon this earlier, but you're talking about oxygen, and then you mentioned the one lady that was getting seizures. So why is too much oxygen a bad thing especially in the case of going under, the ocean?
Okay, so there's a really common cliche when you're talking about physiology, and that's the dose makes the poison. This is the idea that pretty much anything is bad for you if you have enough of it. Um, So even if you overhydrate, if you can overhydrate, you could drink too much water. If you don't balance that out with enough salt, you're going to end up in kidney failure. So the same thing is true with oxygen. We need it to live. But the reason that we need it to live is because on a chemical level, it's really, really reactive. And this was one of my favorite things to write in the book because I kept sending it to my mom and having her read it back. And I knew I hit on the right explanation when my mom explained oxygen toxicity back to me. And I was like, yes. So um, essentially, since oxygen is so reactive, when you start packing more and more into it, your body begins to have an adverse response. It's the dose makes the poison. A little bit helps us live. A lot of it really messes with our brain in ways that aren't still fully understood. So.
So one of the things you talked about in this book was explosions, and explosions are more deadly underwater. It may not make a lot of sense, but could you talk about that? Why is that more worse, I guess, if you wanted to put it in those terms, under the water? It should be above the water if you're getting hit.
Above the water, you have problems like with fireballs and shrapnel. Underwater, you don't really have those because the water stops those from propagating. But you got to think of it like sound. Like, how far away can you hear someone yell on land? And then how far away can you hear a whale singing underwater? So the first one is, maybe a couple hundred yards. The second one is miles. Because the water is so dense, it propagates those signals much, much better. There's a lot less loss involved. And so you can essentially have blast propagate for much further. That was something that I was excited to write because the guy who was doing those trials, Forrest Cameron Wright, he was blasting himself to figure it out. He had that same kind of mentality where he was like, we don't know this. We don't know how far the bombs can go underwater. We know that it's different. We've seen that. And he did the exact same thing that the UCL scientists were doing. He put his own body in the water and then he came out and he used his stethoscope and listened to where in his lungs there was blood. Yeah, so even though he wasn't part of the same lab group, he was working on the same mission because his inventions for like ear protectors and chest protectors were worn by the divers approaching the beaches at D-Day. So that was, yeah, that was, I couldn't imagine that. That's wild to me. Like, we have no idea how far away people need to be safe underwater. We don't know if these ear protectors will work. And he was like, I'll just blow myself up. It's fine.
So we have a question. I don't know anything about this, so maybe you can enlighten us. We have Karen that asks, "What do you know about using oxygen chambers to heal wounds?"
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a PhD, not an MD, so I don't run clinical treatments myself, but the center that I work in does both. So we have, like I said, we have 7 chambers and they're actually all connected to each other. It's like living in a little hamster tube village in the most fun way possible. So the 3 of them do medical treatments and wound healing and wound care, especially for things like MRSA, that's antibiotic resistant staph infections or diabetic wounds, is one of the more common things we treat. And it's the same concept as oxygen toxicity, but again, we're using it for good, right? The more oxygen, if you can put people down there and then we put them on 100% oxygen, we're essentially trying to pack as much oxygen into their bodies as possible without causing harm. Because a lot of those persistent wounds are persistent because you're not getting the circulation and therefore the oxygen required to heal. This means that the hyperbaric oxygen can help the body heal because it's forcing those that critical molecule into the site. So one of the reasons that I really enjoyed hyperbarics is because those treatments, if they're done reputably, often treat people like once or twice a day for a month or so. And we see people who come in on day 1 and they're scared and they're worried and they're in pain. And that's obviously really difficult. But pretty much every time, by the time they're leaving on day 30 or whatever, they're like excited to be there. They're joking around with everyone. Like, they're seeing the results. Like, this is cool. This is helping them. This thing that couldn't be fixed is now getting a lot better. And so there's this like huge optimism swing that's really fun to be around.
So you talked a little bit about it in your talk, the X subs. I think those are the British ones. But reading your book, it seems like these British and Italian mini subs were plagued with a lot of problems. Why would they use them if they're so terrible to use underwater?
I think people will try a lot of these things and a lot of increased risks when they're being bound in their homes. A lot of people, and this happened, you and I spoke a little bit beforehand about the Hunley. The Hunley was a highly experimental submarine during the Civil War in 1864. And I got asked that question all the time. Why would people get into this thing? And the more I research that time period, the more it sounds a lot like the same time period of this war, where people just have this fatigue. They just they sound tired, and they're just willing to do more dangerous things because they're just emotionally exhausted.
So you mentioned a few times rebreathers. Are they the same thing as scuba tanks? And if not, what's the difference?
Oh, okay. So I should have clarified that. I apologize. Rebreathers recycle your gas, so you don't make any bubbles. That's the cool part. With scuba tanks, which first of all, the scuba tanks were not relevant to this particular group because Jacques Cousteau had not yet invented the technology for that. But you also make bubbles. So they were using these rebreathers instead because they were a lot more stealthy. So they allowed them to like creep up to places. I think is pretty awesome.
One of the things I was a little surprised about, and I'm glad I get to answer this question, is so Haldane had, I guess if you wanted to call it communist sympathies.
Yeah.
If that's the case, why did Britain, even though he was under surveillance, why did they let him kind of continue? Was he not that much of a threat, or was his research so important that they thought, okay, well let's just see what's happens here?
The indications are that the research was just that important. And they realized that he was the only person or the only group of people who could do it because there are so many examples he was being monitored by MI5 the whole war. And there's so many examples of people complaining about him and being like, why hasn't he been put in an internment camp yet? Because they were putting the communists in internment camps. And a lot of these complaints are coming like maybe not the same day, but the same week as he's getting active requests from the British government that just sound really desperate. Um,
So one of the things I'll have to ask is, I think it's really fascinating. There were a lot of scientist refugees from Europe, especially some of the Jewish people that unfortunately, because of Nazi Germany, they were getting persecuted, and they went to Britain. Can you kind of maybe just briefly talk about that, what impact they had in the research in Haldane?
yeah, that was something was that writing that was a new experience for me because several of these lab members are Jewish refugees. They escaped from mainland Germany. One of them, Hans Kalmus, he came over in advance of his family, and then his family barely escaped the Nazis. And like it's weird how it happened. They didn't know they were in such risk at the time, but it turns out like they almost got put in concentration camps. And so this was something to write these refugee stories. I really relied on the children, the children of the scientists, some of whom were alive and experienced these flights. And so to write that, it was really important to me to provide as much humanity to it as possible. But I thought that this was kind of a beautiful example of um, people being good, right? It's like Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers. So me making sure that I could include as many of these refugee stories, and then being sponsored and paid for and brought over was my attempt to show people the helpers. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, several of them, Hans Kalmus, Ursula Philipp, Hans Gruneberg, are some of the members of the lab who are participating in these experiments who had barely fled with their lives and came over to England and then voluntarily stepped into these chambers and put their bodies on the line in order to help the country that had helped them.
Okay, great. So we have time for one question, and it involves a little bit. You talked about Dieppe and Churchill in the beginning, and so why did the Allies not really, I guess, appreciate, if you want to call that, Churchill's experience? You talked about Gallipoli. Did they just ignore him, or did they basically just say, "We need to do something in Europe. Let's go ahead and land"? I mean, is that really 100% true, or what was kind of going on with landing there?
They weren't really clear in the records. Like, that's something that I would like to know too, because Churchill was not a person who would like accept no if he wanted. He didn't want to. So I'm not 100% certain about that. The records that was able to find indicate that they just wouldn't really listen to him. And that there was pressure from the Russians, and that they were like, well, let's just try it. And Churchill was very stubborn, but he was also a person who was willing to let soldiers die to prove his point. So it's entirely possible that he was just like, fine, see what happens. But again, like the records are not super clear. So I know people probably have to go. I'm not cutting anyone off, but I put oh, that's my email. But I also have a contact form on my website. And so if anyone has any additional questions they'd like to ask, please do feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. But thank you so much, Dr. Lance, for your wonderful talk on the chamber dyers. It was fantastic. And I'll also plug your other book because that's how I found out about you, about the CSS Huntley. That was fantastic. So thank
Oh,
you so
good.
much for taking time out to talk to us about your newest book here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is really fun for me because I think these people are a different kind of war hero. Like they may not have been the ones to run with a gun, but they brought the skill set that they had, and they put themselves at really huge risk, and they made a lot of sacrifices in order to make a difference. And so like I always say that the troops on the day of June 6th are the ones who deserve credit for the success, but this group deserves credit for a lot of them coming home. So they brought home a lot of people that wouldn't have made it otherwise.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wonderful story with us. We're looking forward to your next book. So thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for
Hey, thanks for
coming.
coming out, everyone. Good night.